And so from here, I want to get a little bit to the language that then gets used. And so the key point I want to be making here, and I really want to take everyone to take home from here, there's a lot of language that gets thrown around about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, about decarbonization and everything. And there's really one term among all of them that comes from the science, and that's net zero. So net zero is out there in the world. It's used all the time by companies, countries, et cetera. And it just sounds like any other term. But as I've described, it really directly comes from the scientific results. Other terms are a little bit fuzzier as a result. So net zero, that's what it sounds like. Emissions minus removal. We can't add anything to the atmosphere. And that is the scientifically derived one. It's also the legislated objective in a lot of countries around the world, including Canada, right? Carbon neutral, there's nothing wrong with it as a term. People have used it for years, and they're often used interchangeably. And sometimes that's okay, but the problem is carbon neutral doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, right? Carbon neutral technically is only referring to carbon or carbon dioxide. Now, often companies or individuals use it, and they're just implying all greenhouse gases, but you don't know when you use the term, right? And so it could be ignoring other CO2 gases. But the other problem with carbon neutral is it's really a legacy of an older way of thinking about the problem, right? 20, 25 years ago, when I first started studying climate change in school, we talked about reducing emissions, right? So that was the paradigm at the time. But now that we've recognized that the goal needs to be eliminating emissions if we want to stop warming, we've moved from this emissions reduction paradigm to an emissions elimination paradigm. Carbon neutral comes from the old emissions reduction landscape. And what I mean by that is in the old days, it was, well, our company could get to carbon neutral because we'll try to cut our emissions, and that which we can't cut, we'll buy offsets, right? And so that might not necessarily achieve the actual purpose of not adding greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Remember, that's the take home. We can't add anything to the atmosphere if we want the planet to stop warming. And so carbon neutral often ends up involving offsets, right? And we've all heard of this before, and a lot of you are very familiar with this world. And we need to talk a little bit about the reality of carbon offsets, because carbon offsets, again, are a legacy of the emissions reduction rather than emissions elimination paradigm. So the concept is quite simple. It's the idea that we need to balance the emissions from one set of activities by financing reductions elsewhere. So if we try to reduce our emissions and we can't get to zero, we can buy credits from somebody else that's done more, right? The problem with this is that for offsets to actually work and help us address climate change, this ultimate goal, they have to be additional, meaning you have to be sure you're paying for something that would not have happened anyways. They've got to be permanent, meaning it's got to stay in place, and they've got to be verified, meaning we got to be sure that this is real. Right? And there's all sorts of verification companies out there. People are, I think many of you are accustomed to this. And this is where the shift in paradigms really matters, because offsets really come in a couple different categories. And one category is just not useful for getting to net zero. And that is the most common category of offsets, which is avoided emissions. So we are going to give money to buy offsets because buy an avoided emissions offset would be like another company is offering to build a set of wind turbines to shift away from the way they generated electricity before, from natural gas or coal, right? So so you are going to avoid future emissions by doing that, right? But that's not stopping your emissions from going up in the atmosphere. That's removing that's getting rid of emissions that could have happened in the future that were avoided. But if you want to get to net zero and your company is still emitting to the atmosphere, you need to actually remove that amount of carbon you're emitting from the atmosphere. Removals, emissions minus removals. And so avoided emissions just don't really work in this paradigm, right? And the problem with the avoided emissions from offsets is, yes, there are verification companies, but everyone who works in this field can tell you that this is really hard to verify. How do we know that that activity would not have happened without the purchased offsets? One of the ways that we know that avoided emissions offsets are usually not terribly effective is they are too cheap. If it costs far less to buy offsets, then the cost of emitting the greenhouse gases, it's probably not actually doing the job, right? So the types of offsets that you need are ones that actually remove emissions from the atmosphere, right? And so those are things like planting trees, taking carbon that, do photosynthesis, take carbon out of the air, or technological measures like direct air capture, like the carbon engineering plant in Squamish that pulls CO2 out of the air, right? These things can be part of a net zero future, but remember, they need to be permanent. If you do something to pull carbon dioxide out of the air, but then the next year it just goes back up, well, that didn't solve anything, right? And so there's a reason I have that picture of the smoke in Yellowknife from forest fires in the background. If you invest in a tree planting operation, that's wonderful. It's important things that the planet needs. But that forest could burn down a couple years later and that CO2 could be back up in the atmosphere. And even if it doesn't, trees are not permanent removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere necessarily, right? Eventually the trees break down and the CO2 goes back up in the atmosphere. It's not the best way to counter emissions from fossil fuels, which are coming from a reservoir deeper in the earth that would stay there for a very long time if it wasn't for us extracting it, right? So in the end, the advice from the experts on this is that there are forms of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions, a little bit from cement, from steel creation, that we may not be able to ever get to zero. And we should reserve the removal for those actions. But other things that we can actually eliminate, we need to eliminate them and not depend on offsets, because offsets aren't trustworthy enough.